I want to tell you about the morning I went back for my military ID, because if I hadn't, I might be someone's wife right now instead of someone's cautionary tale. 3 weeks before my wedding, I stood frozen behind my own back door, listening to the man I loved describe in a calm and pleasant voice exactly how he planned to take everything I owned. He didn't know I was standing there. He didn't know what I did for a living, and he had no idea that the woman he was about to marry had spent 12 years learning how to spot a liar for a living. My name is Heather Morgan. I'm 35 years old, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, and for the better part of my career, I've worked in a division. Most people never hear about internal investigations, fraud detection, the quiet rooms where we untangle the financial crimes that happen inside a uniform. I've spent years reading spreadsheets the way other people read novels, hunting for the small inconsistency that tells you someone is stealing. I've testified against officers who thought they were smarter than the system. I've learned that the most dangerous people rarely look dangerous. They look charming. They look trustworthy. They look exactly like the man I was engaged to. Daniel Carter was 38, a financial advisor with an easy laugh, and the kind of manners that made older women at parties clutch his arm and tell me how lucky I was. He opened doors. He remembered birthdays. He asked thoughtful questions and actually listened to the answers. When I introduced him to my friends, more than one of them pulled me aside afterward and said some version of the same thing. "You found a good one, Heather. Hold on to him." I never told him the truth about my work. It wasn't a lie exactly. It was a habit built over years of handling sensitive cases that I couldn't discuss with anyone outside a secure room. Daniel knew I was an officer. He knew I worked long hours and traveled sometimes without explanation. He believed, because I let him believe it, that I handled administrative logistics, paperwork, personnel schedules, nothing interesting. I told myself I was protecting the integrity of my cases. Looking back, some part of me may have also been protecting something else, though I wouldn't understand that until later, 8 months into our engagement. Everything about our life together felt settled in the way that good things settle quietly without drama. We'd picked a venue. We'd sent invitations. My mother had already cried twice, looking at swatches of blue fabric for the bridesmaids' dresses. Daniel handled most of the wedding logistics himself, which I'd found endearing at the time. He said he wanted to make things easy for me since my job kept me busy. He said he loved taking care of things. That morning started like any other. I left the house a little after 7, dressed in plain clothes since I had a personal errand before reporting to base, dropping off dry cleaning, picking up coffee, the small, unremarkable tasks that fill the edges of a life. I was maybe 10 minutes down the road, stopped at a light when I reached for my bag, and realized my military ID wasn't in it. I'd left it on the kitchen counter, right next to my keys, in the spot where I always left it, and somehow hadn't grabbed that morning. I turned the car around without a second thought. It was an ordinary inconvenience, the kind that happens a dozen times a year and means nothing. I remember feeling mildly annoyed with myself. Nothing more. I had no sense pulling back into our driveway that I was about to learn something that would unravel everything I thought I understood about the next 50 years of my life. I let myself in through the side gate instead of the front door out of habit. More than anything, it was closer to where I'd parked. As I came around toward the back porch, I heard Daniel's voice. He was on the phone, pacing near the railing with his back to me, and something about his tone stopped me before I'd even registered why. It wasn't his warm voice, the one he used with me. It was clipped, businesslike, a voice I didn't recognize. I almost called out to him right then. My hand was actually lifting to wave when I caught the sentence that made me go still. Once the marriage license is signed, everything else falls into place on schedule. I don't know how to explain what happened in my body in that moment. It wasn't panic, not yet. It was something colder, the same stillness I get when I'm reading a financial statement, and a single number doesn't match the story around it. Instinct took over before understanding did. I stepped back against the wall of the house out of his sightline, and I listened. He kept talking, his voice low, and measured the tone of a man laying out a plan he'd rehearsed before. He said that after the wedding, he'd bring up some paperwork, something about consolidating our finances, making things simpler to manage as a married couple. He made it sound reasonable, even generous. But I know what a general power of attorney sounds like, when someone is trying to make it sound like a formality. I've read hundreds of documents, exactly like the one he was describing, and none of them were formalities. Then he laughed quiet and pleased with himself and said that I had more assets than I even realized, and that I clearly had no idea how to protect them. My chest tightened. I stood there in my own backyard in my own life, listening to my fiancé talk about my future as though it were a project he'd already completed on paper. The worst part came a few seconds later, delivered so casually it almost didn't register at first. If she figures it out, it'll already be too late anyway. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Somewhere behind my ribs, 12 years of training clicked into place. And before I'd even decided to do it, I had my phone out and the voice recorder running, capturing every word through the thin morning air. I want to be honest with you, I didn't confront him. Not that day, not for a long time after. Standing there, I understood something with total clarity. I no longer knew who the man on that porch was, and I was about to find out exactly how far he was willing to go. I didn't say a word to him that morning. I walked back to my car the same way I'd come, quiet, unhurried, my face arranged into nothing at all. Inside, something had already shifted permanently. But I've spent my career learning how to keep my expression still while my mind runs at full speed. And that morning, that training became the only thing standing between me and a decision I might have regretted. I drove to base like I did every day. I sat at my desk, answered emails, sat through a briefing I couldn't tell you a single detail about afterward. Around noon, I finally closed my office door, put in my earbuds, and listened to the recording again. Then again, by the third time, I wasn't hearing my fiancé anymore. I was hearing a subject. That's the word we use for someone under investigation. And somewhere in that sterile little word, I found the distance I needed to function. What struck me most wasn't the plan itself, though. That was bad enough. It was the ease of it. The rhythm of his voice had the cadence of something rehearsed, something worn smooth by repetition. The way people sound when they've said the same reassuring lie to a client many times before. In my line of work, you learn that amateurs sound nervous, professionals sound bored. Daniel had sounded bored. I called Marcus that afternoon. He'd been my training partner years ago, when I first moved into investigations, and he'd since transferred to a unit that specialized in background verification, legal above-board work, the kind that shows up in due diligence reports rather than courtrooms. I told him I needed a favor personal, and he didn't ask many questions, which was one of the reasons I trusted him. I gave him Daniel's full name, date of birth, and the city where he grew up, and I asked him to run what he could through public records and licensing databases. Nothing classified, nothing that would raise flags, just the truth, whatever it turned out to be. He called me back 2 days later, and I remember exactly where I was standing when my phone rang because I never sat down for that conversation. I stood in my kitchen with my back against the counter, staring at nothing, while Marcus read off what he'd found in a flat, careful voice, like he already suspected. I wasn't going to like it. Daniel had been engaged twice before me. Both times the engagements had ended within a year of the wedding date. One canceled outright, one that apparently clears throat went through and dissolved in an annulment within 8 months. Both women had, according to property records Marcus could access, transferred significant assets into joint accounts or trusts naming Daniel as co-owner or trustee shortly before those relationships ended. Both women had, as far as public records showed, walked away with a fraction of what they'd brought into the relationship, and neither of them had filed a single complaint, a single lawsuit, a single police report. I asked Marcus if that seemed strange to him too. He said something I haven't forgotten. He said in his experience, people who've been embarrassed rarely want an audience for their embarrassment. They sign what's put in front of them and they disappear. And they tell themselves it was a lesson learned rather than a crime committed against them. Snorts. Most of them never even use the word victim. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. I thought about the way Daniel talked about his past relationships, always with a gentle, almost wounded tone, always framing himself as the one who'd been hurt, who'd trusted too easily, who'd learned to be careful. I thought about how good that story had sounded to me, how completely I'd believed it, how many times I'd found myself wanting to protect him from women I'd never met, and never would. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. This wasn't paranoia. I know the difference between suspicion and evidence, and I built this understanding the same way I'd build a case file at work, slowly, methodically, refusing to let myself draw conclusions faster than the facts could support them. But by that second night, lying awake next to a man who had no idea what I now knew, I understood that I wasn't dealing with a single lie. I was looking at a pattern, and patterns in my experience don't happen by accident. I began doing something I'm not proud of, though I don't regret it either. I started paying closer attention to Daniel in a way I never had before, not as his fiancé, but as an investigator watching a subject. I noticed things I had overlooked or explained away. The way he always steered conversations toward my finances under the guise of wedding budgeting. The way he'd casually mention how nice it would be to combine our accounts for simplicity. The way he'd bring up estate planning with a kind of gentle urgency, as though it were something responsible adults simply did, rather than something that would hand him control over everything I'd built in 12 years of service. I thought about calling off the wedding right then. I sat with my phone in my hand more than once. His name pulled up on the screen, ready to end it with a single sentence. But something held me back, and it wasn't sentiment. It was the two women before me, the ones who'd signed and disappeared and never said a word. If I walked away quietly now, Daniel would simply recover, recalibrate, and find someone else. He would do this again. I had spent my career going after people who thought they could take what wasn't theirs and vanish before anyone noticed. I wasn't going to let this be the one case I walked away from. So, instead of confronting him, I did the only thing that made sense to someone trained the way I was trained. I decided to build a case quietly, carefully, and I decided that Daniel Carter was going to find out in the worst possible way exactly who he thought he was marrying. For the next several weeks, I became someone I'd never had to be before, an actress in my own life. I smiled at the right moments. I laughed at his jokes. I let him hold my hand across restaurant tables and tell me in that warm voice he saved just for me how excited he was to finally make things official. Every night I went home and played the part of a woman deeply in love. And every night I lay awake afterward, running through what I'd learned, feeling the strange exhaustion that comes from performing devotion you no longer fully feel. Daniel, meanwhile, grew bolder. It started small, a suggestion here, a passing comment there, but within 2 weeks, the requests had a clear shape to them, and once I saw the shape, I couldn't unsee it. He wanted to merge our bank accounts before the wedding, so everything's already streamlined when we get back from the honeymoon. He wanted to add himself as the primary beneficiary on my life insurance policy, framing it as just standard practice for married couples. He brought up putting his name on the deed to my house, the house I'd bought myself with my own money 3 years before I ever met him, describing it as a gesture of trust between partners. And then, almost gently, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned a document his associate could draw up, something called a durable power of attorney, just in case anything ever happened to either of us, so the other person could handle things without a legal headache. I agreed to all of it on the surface. I told him it sounded reasonable. I told him I trusted him completely. I watched something settle into his face each time I said yes. Not joy exactly, but satisfaction. The particular look of a man watching a plan proceed on schedule. Behind the scenes, I was doing something very different. I found an attorney 2 towns over. Someone with no connection to Daniel or our social circle. A woman named Patricia Reyes, who specialized in estate and financial law. I told her everything, the recording Marcus findings, the documents Daniel was asking me to sign. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, before she said something I still think about. She said that what I was describing wasn't unusual in its individual pieces. Couples merge accounts, couples update beneficiaries. What made it different was the sequencing and the pressure, and the fact that every single document benefited one person substantially more than the other. She walked me through what would actually happen if I signed everything Daniel was asking for. The power of attorney alone would have given him legal authority to manage, transfer, or liquidate nearly every asset I owned without needing my signature on individual transactions. Combined with joint accounts and a shared deed. I would have handed him in practice, if not in explicit language control, over almost everything I had built in 12 years of service and saving. Patricia didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. She simply laid the documents side by side and let me see the shape of the trap for myself. It was around this time that I learned something else. Something that made my stomach turn in a way the earlier discoveries hadn't quite managed to do. I'd met Daniel's mother, Carol, only a handful of times. Always brief, always pleasant. She was polished and warm in the same practiced way her son was, and I'd never thought much of it, beyond assuming that's simply where he'd learned his manners. But when I mentioned to Patricia, almost in passing, that Carol had been the one to recommend the financial associate who'd suggested some of these documents, Patricia went quiet again, and then asked me to get her the associate's name. It took her firm less than a week to find what she was looking for. The associate wasn't licensed to give the kind of financial advice he'd been giving. He had no verifiable credentials at all. In fact, no registration, no oversight, nothing beyond a business card and a confident manner. And Carol, it turned out, had a documented history of being present in one capacity or another around both of Daniel's previous engagements. She wasn't simply his mother offering warm support to a son in love. She was, as far as the pattern suggested, a participant. I remember sitting in my car outside Patricia's office after that conversation, gripping the steering wheel, trying to process the idea that I wasn't dealing with one manipulative man, but with a family that had built something close to a system, a rehearsed script, a trusted associate, a supportive mother smoothing the edges. I thought about the two women before me again, and for the first time, I let myself really imagine what those final months must have looked like for them. The same warmth, the same gentle pressure, the same slow narrowing of options until signing away. Everything felt not like a loss but like a reasonable, even loving decision. I didn't cry that day, though I came close. What I felt instead was something harder and more useful. 12 years in this line of work had taught me that anger without a plan is just noise. So, I sat there until the feeling passed, and then I called Patricia back and asked her exactly one question. What would it take to protect everything I owned so completely that none of this would matter, no matter what I signed in the weeks ahead? She told me it could be done. It would take time, discretion, and precision. I told her I had all three. By the time I drove home that evening, I had made a decision that would define everything that followed. Daniel could keep planning his wedding. I would be planning something else entirely, and he wouldn't see it coming until it was far too late to stop. I requested 4 days of personal leave the following week, telling Daniel I needed to help my mother with something back in Ohio. It was the first outright lie I told him, and I remember how easily it came, how naturally my voice stayed level as I said it. That unsettled me more than I expected. I'd spent my whole career catching people who lied smoothly, and now I understood in a way I never had before exactly how smooth it could feel from the other side. I didn't go to Ohio. I stayed local working with Patricia and a private investigator she trusted named Ray Delgado, a former detective who'd spent 15 years on financial crimes before going independent. I was careful about how I approached all of it. This wasn't a military investigation, and I never once used my position, my clearance, or any Army resource to pursue it. Every step went through civilian channels: Patricia's firm, Ray's license, public records, and legal financial disclosures. I wanted this done right, not just effectively. If Daniel was going to be exposed, it needed to hold up outside of anything I could personally influence. Ray started with the basics: surveillance, financial footprints, patterns of movement. Within 2 days, he found something I hadn't anticipated. Daniel was meeting regularly with a woman named Jessica Hale, always at the same coffee shop downtown, always with folders and a laptop between them. At first, watching the photos Ray sent over, I felt something twist low in my stomach, the obvious assumption rising before I could stop it. But Ray was careful to tell me not to jump ahead of the evidence, and when he finally got close enough to overhear part of one conversation, the picture became both less personal and far worse. Jessica wasn't a girlfriend. She was a business partner, and the business, as it turned out, was people like me. Ray's notes described the two of them reviewing what looked like financial documents, statements, property records, something that resembled the same kind of file Patricia had built for me. Except this one was about my life assembled by the two people I trusted least. They discussed timelines. They discussed the wedding date. At one point, Jessica's voice came through clearly enough for Rai to catch her asking whether the house would be listed right after, and Daniel confirming that it would once ownership had transferred the way they'd planned. The house, my house, the one I'd bought with a down payment I'd saved for 3 years while stationed overseas, eating the same base cafeteria food for months, so I could put every spare dollar away. Hearing that they'd already discussed selling it so casually, as though it were simply the next item on a checklist, did something to me that the earlier discoveries hadn't. I'd been able to stay analytical about the accounts, the power of attorney, even his mother's involvement. This felt different. This felt like watching someone plan the demolition of something I'd built with my own hands without me in the room. Ray's deeper financial work uncovered the piece that finally made the entire picture click into place. Daniel wasn't simply greedy or opportunistic. He was drowning. Through a combination of public court filings, lien records, and a source Ray had cultivated at a local title company, we learned that Daniel had lost more than $800,000 in a series of failed real estate investments over the previous 2 years. He owed money to at least 3 different private lenders, one of whom had already filed a judgment against him that he'd managed to keep quiet by settling just enough to avoid it becoming public knowledge through normal channels. His financial advisory business, the one that had impressed me so much when we met, was barely functioning. Most of his income over the past year had come from somewhere else entirely, and Ree strongly suspected that somewhere else was women exactly like me. I sat with Patricia and Ray in her office on the 3rd night of my supposed trip to Ohio, looking at a timeline they'd built across a whiteboard: dates, dollar amounts, names, 2 previous fiancés, a pattern of asset transfers, a mother with a documented role, an unlicensed financial associate, a business partner conducting what amounted to due diligence on a future victim, $800,000 in debt that would vanish the moment he had access to what I owned. It wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a structure built carefully over years, refined with each attempt, and I happened to be standing in the spot where it was about to close. I asked Patricia somewhat numbly what would have happened to me if I hadn't gone back for my ID that morning. She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, she said that based on everything they'd found, I likely would have signed the power of attorney within the first few months of marriage, framed as routine, urged along by both Daniel and his mother. Within a year, possibly less control over my assets would have shifted almost entirely to him, and by the time I noticed, if I noticed at all unwinding, it would have required exactly the kind of expensive, humiliating legal fight that Rai said both previous women had clearly decided wasn't worth having. I drove back into town that night instead of waiting for my leave to officially end. I didn't go home. I sat in a diner parking lot for almost an hour, engine off, watching people come and go through the window. Ordinary people living ordinary lives. None of them aware of how close I'd come to losing everything, to a man who still at that very moment believed he had me completely fooled. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the loud way I'd been a week earlier. What I felt was quieter and far more dangerous to Daniel, though he had no way of knowing that yet. I felt ready. I came home from my trip to Ohio and told Daniel it had been exhausting, that my mother's hip surgery recovery had taken more out of both of us than expected. He hugged me at the door, told me I looked tired, made me tea, and asked if there was anything he could do to make the next 3 weeks easier on me. I let him fuss over me for a few minutes. And I remember thinking with a strange clinical detachment that he was genuinely good at this. Not good as in kind, good as in skilled. It was in its own way useful information. I needed to know exactly what I was up against. The wedding preparations moved forward without interruption. Nightitations had already gone out weeks earlier, so there was no reasonable way to pause things, even if I'd wanted to, and I didn't want to. Patricia and I had discussed this at length. Calling off the wedding early would only give Daniel time to regroup, to disappear, to try this again with someone else in another city under another version of his story. If I wanted this to actually end, not just for me, but for whoever might have come after me, I needed him to walk all the way to the altar believing he'd won. So, I played my part. I picked out flowers with my mother, who kept asking with the particular radar mothers have whether everything was really all right. I told her yes, everything was fine, and hated myself a little for the lie. Though I promised myself I'd explain everything to her the moment it was over. I tried on my dress for the final fitting, and stood in front of the mirror while the seamstress pinned the waist, watching my own face in the reflection, and thinking about how strange it was to look so calm on the outside while planning in careful legal detail the dismantling of the man standing at the center of all this. Daniel grew more relaxed as the wedding approached, not less, which told me everything about how confident he'd become. He started dropping little comments about our future, together with a new ease, the kind of comfort that comes when someone believes the hardest part is already behind them. 2 weeks before the ceremony, he brought home the final version of the paperwork, the power of attorney, the account consolidation, forms an updated beneficiary designation on my life insurance policy. He'd had his associate draw it all up, so we wouldn't have to deal with it during the honeymoon. He slid the folder across the kitchen table, like a man presenting a gift. I read through it slowly, the way I imagined. He expected me to nodding at the appropriate places, asking a question or two about wording that made me seem thoughtful rather than suspicious. Then I signed it. All of it, every page. What Daniel didn't know, and what he had no reason to suspect, was that Patricia and I had spent the previous week preparing exactly for this moment. The documents in that folder were never going to touch anything real. Weeks earlier, quietly and with airtight legal precision, Patricia had helped me move the substantial majority of my actual assets into an irrevocable trust, my savings, my investment accounts, and eventually, through a separate and fully legal transaction, the Clears Throat equity in my house. The trust had its own trustee, its own protections, and its own terms that made it essentially untouchable by anyone outside a very narrow set of circumstances, none of which included a fraudulent power of attorney signed by a woman who already knew exactly what was being attempted. The papers Daniel had proudly presented me with were in practice close to meaningless. They granted him authority over accounts that by the time I signed held only a fraction of what he believed was there. The house deed transfer he'd requested applied to a property whose real value had already been restructured through the trust. He held a folder full of signatures that looked on paper like total victory. In reality, he held almost nothing. I want to be honest about how strange that moment felt watching him take the signed documents back with such quiet satisfaction, thanking me for making this so easy, kissing my forehead like he was closing a business deal rather than promising his life to someone. Some small tired part of me still ached even then. I'd loved this man, or at least the version of him he'd shown me for 8 months. Grieving that version, even while dismantling the real one, turned out to be more complicated than I expected. I didn't let it slow me down, but I let myself feel it briefly alone in the bathroom that night, with the water running so no one would hear anything. The final days moved quickly after that. My mother arrived in town 3 days early, fussing over centerpieces and seating charts, completely unaware of the storm gathering underneath the surface of what she assumed was simply wedding week nerves on my part. My best friend from officer training, Nadia, flew in and immediately sensed something was off, cornering me in the kitchen one evening and asking point blank if I was having second thoughts. I told her the truth, in a way. I told her that I had never been more certain of anything in my life. She took it as reassurance about the marriage. I let her. Patricia and Rye stayed close throughout that final week, coordinating quietly, making sure every document, every recording, every piece of evidence was organized and ready. Patricia would be at the wedding, seated toward the back, dressed like any other guest, carrying nothing that would suggest she was about to become the most important person in the room, besides Daniel and me. We had gone over the plan more times than I could count. There would be no scene at the reception, no dramatic confrontation in a parking lot after the fact. If this was going to happen, it was going to happen exactly where Daniel had planned to claim his victory at the altar, in front of everyone who had ever believed in the man he'd built himself to look like. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of the mirror in my dress, my mother fastening the last button at the back, tears already in her eyes, for reasons that had nothing to do with what I knew and everything to do with what she still believed. I looked at my own reflection and felt something settle into place, calm and certain. The same feeling I used to get right before walking into a room to deliver findings that would end someone's career. I was ready. Daniel had no idea what was waiting for him. The chapel was full by the time I stood behind the doors, my father's arm steady beneath my hand, the string quartet playing something soft and familiar that I couldn't have named if my life depended on it. Through the small gap in the doorway, I could see the room white flowers lining the aisle. Daniel's family filling the left side, mine filling the right. Nearly 200 people who had traveled in some cases across the country to watch two people promise their lives to each other. I could see Daniel at the front, adjusting his cufflinks, glancing toward the door every few seconds with an expression of pure, uncomplicated happiness. I remember thinking that he looked genuinely excited, and that this, more than anything else I'd learned about him, told me exactly what kind of person I was dealing with. He wasn't nervous. Men who are about to commit themselves, honestly, are nervous. He was simply pleased. The doors opened and I walked down the aisle exactly the way I'd rehearsed it in my mind for weeks, poised, composed, smiling at the right faces, my hand steady on my father's arm. I reached the front. Daniel took my hand, his fingers warm and certain around mine, and for one brief unwelcome moment, some old part of me, at how easy this still felt, how convincingly his face could still perform love. Then I let that moment pass, and I became once again exactly who I needed to be. The officiant began the ceremony. I listened to the opening words with a strange, distant calm, the same feeling I used to get in the seconds before delivering a verdict I already knew the outcome of. We moved through the early portions of the service, and when the officiant reached the point where he asked if anyone present had reason, the two of us should not be joined in marriage, I felt the entire room hold its breath out of pure ceremonial habit, the way it always does at weddings. Nobody actually expecting an answer. I spoke instead. My voice came out steadier than I expected. I asked if I could say a few words before we continued, and I watched confusion flicker across Daniel's face, quickly smoothed over into something patient and indulgent, as though he assumed I simply wanted a personal moment before we exchanged vows. I turned slightly toward the guests, found Patricia's calm, steady face near the back of the room, and reached into the small clutch I'd been carrying. Pulling out my phone, I told the room in a clear and even voice that 3 weeks earlier, I had gone back home to grab something I'd forgotten, and that what I overheard that morning changed everything. I thought I understood about the man standing beside me. I pressed play. Daniel's own voice filled the chapel, cutting cleanly through the silence, describing his plan to secure my signature on documents that would hand him control of everything I owned. I watched his face as his own words reached the back rows, watched the color drain from him in real time, watched 200 people go from confused to horrified within the space of about 15 seconds. He reached for my arm, said my name, started to say something about how I was misunderstanding out of context. But his own recorded voice was still playing, and the line about it already being too late, if I figured it out, landed into a silence so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. When the recording ended, Patricia rose from her seat and walked calmly to the front of the room, the way she'd practiced, carrying a folder that looked almost identical to the one Daniel had presented me with weeks earlier. Except everything inside it was real. She introduced herself simply as my attorney and asked for the room's patience for just a few minutes. She laid it out clearly without theatrics the way good lawyers do. She explained that Daniel Carter had concealed more than $800 zuzozoned in personal debt from his fiancé, that he had, along with an associate operating without proper licensing, attempted to secure a power of attorney and beneficiary changes that would have transferred substantial control of my assets to him following the marriage. That public records showed a pattern stretching back through 2 previous engagements, both ending with similar transfers of assets and no formal complaints filed, and that as of that morning, none of it mattered, because every document Daniel believed he'd secured applied to assets that had already been legally and irrevocably protected weeks in advance. I watched Daniel's mother, Carol, go pale near the front row, her hand rising slightly to her mouth. I watched her husband turn to look at her with an expression I didn't have time to interpret before she stood, gathered her purse, and walked quickly out the side door, without a word to anyone including her son. Daniel tried again to speak, his voice cracking, now insisting this was all some kind of misunderstanding, that he could explain everything if I would just give him a chance. Nobody in that room was interested in giving him a chance. I watched guest by guest people I'd known my whole life, and people I'd never met begin to rise from their seats. Not in a chaotic rush, not in a scene from a movie, but quietly, deliberately, 1 row at a time, filing toward the doors with the particular silence of people who had just watched something true happen in a room built for promises. My father stood by beside me the entire time, his hand steady on my shoulder, saying nothing, needing to say nothing. My mother stood frozen for a long moment before crossing the front of the chapel and simply putting her arms around me, and I let myself lean into her for exactly as long as I needed to. No longer performing anything for anyone, Daniel stood alone near the altar as the last of the guests filed out his cufflinks, still perfectly straight, his carefully rehearsed charm completely useless against a room that had just heard in his own voice exactly who he really was. I looked at him one last time, and I felt none of the things I might have expected. No rage, no satisfaction, nothing dramatic at all. I felt only the quiet, settled relief of someone who had done thorough work, and watched it hold exactly as intended. Then I turned, and I walked out of that chapel on my father's arm, still in my wedding dress, toward whatever came next. The wedding that never happened became, in its own strange way, the most talked about event in our small circle for months afterward, though not for any reason Daniel would have wanted. Within days, the story had traveled well beyond the 200 people who'd been sitting in those pews. I didn't share it publicly myself. I didn't need to. Patricia had, with my full cooperation, already forwarded our complete file, the recording, the financial records, the pattern of prior engagements, Ray's investigative findings to both a civil attorney representing my interests and the appropriate licensing board, overseeing financial advisors in our state. Daniel's professional license was suspended within 6 weeks, pending a formal review that, from what I later heard, found more than enough grounds to revoke it permanently. The firm he'd worked for quietly let him go before the suspension even became public, unwilling to have their name anywhere near what was starting to surface. His unlicensed associate, the one who drafted the fraudulent paperwork, faced his own separate legal troubles once. State regulators started asking questions about who he'd been advising and under what authority. What surprised me most in the weeks that followed wasn't Daniel's unraveling. I'd expected that, planned for it, in some sense, already grieved it before it happened. What surprised me was what came after Patricia's office at my request reached out through legal channels to the 2 women whose names Marcus had first uncovered months earlier. I hadn't known what to expect. Silence, maybe embarrassment. Instead, both women eventually chose to come forward. First quietly through their own attorneys, and then once they understood, they weren't alone, with a directness that told me how long they'd been waiting for someone to believe them. Neither had ever filed a police report at the time, exactly as Ray predicted. But with documentation now connecting 3 separate cases, civil suits became possible in a way they hadn't been before. I don't know how those cases will ultimately resolve. I know that Daniel is now facing them without the calm, unshakable confidence he once wore so easily, and I know that the women who once disappeared quietly are no longer disappearing. As for me, I went back to work. There was no parade, no announcement, nothing to mark the fact that I'd walked away from a wedding, still wearing the dress. I filed my leave paperwork, returned to my desk, and picked up exactly where I'd left off, because that's what 12 years of discipline teaches you to do. My colleagues who knew pieces of the story were kind about it in the understated way soldiers tend to be kind to each other. A hand on the shoulder, a quiet "you good" in passing, nothing that required me to relive it out loud more than necessary. I didn't feel triumphant, not in the way people sometimes assume I must have. I've thought about that a lot since. What I felt mostly was a deep and steady gratitude, the kind that settles into your chest rather than announcing itself. Gratitude that I'd forgotten my ID that particular morning. Gratitude for 12 years of training that taught me to listen, before reacting to gather evidence, before making accusations to trust a pattern over a feeling. Gratitude for Patricia and Ray and Marcus, and every person who helped me build something solid enough to stand on while the ground underneath me was quietly being pulled away. I think about the 2 women who came before me sometimes. The ones who signed and walked away, and told themselves it was simply a lesson learned. I understand now in a way I couldn't have before this happened to me, exactly how someone ends up there. It isn't stupidity. It isn't weakness. It's love offered honestly to someone who has learned precisely how to exploit it. I was fortunate enough to have the tools, the training, and the timing to see it before it was too late. Not everyone does. That's part of why when people ask me if I regret how public parts of this eventually became, I tell them no. If sharing what happened to me keeps even one other person from signing away their life to someone who rehearsed the words in advance, then walking down that aisle and speaking up in front of everyone I knew was worth every uncomfortable second. In the military, they train you to recognize threats from an enemy you can see coming. Someone in uniform, someone on the other side of a clearly drawn line. Nobody trains you for the version that shows up holding flowers, remembering your coffee order, telling you that you're the best thing that's ever happened to him. That was the hardest lesson of my career, and I didn't learn it in any classroom or briefing room. I learned it in my own backyard on an ordinary morning, because I happened to turn my car around for a piece of plastic with my photo on it. I don't know exactly where my life goes from here. I know I'm not in a hurry to trust easily again, and I know that's all right. I know I still believe in love, real love, the kind that doesn't come with hidden paperwork or rehearsed timelines. And I know that whatever comes next for me, I'll be walking into it with my eyes open exactly the way I should have been from the start. If you've made it this far with me, I want to thank you for sitting with this story. It wasn't an easy one to live, and it wasn't always an easy one to tell. I'd love to know what stayed with you most, and where in the world you're watching from tonight. Leave a comment below, and let me know. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you. So, if this reached you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's keep walking through these stories. I am Naomi, 33 years old, and I spent a decade building an empire out of the scraps my parents left me when they cut me off at 18. My spoiled sister was always treated like the star. Private schools, lavish trips, a brand new convertible at 23. But during our grandmother's 80th birthday dinner at a Michelin star restaurant, she thought she finally caught me in a lie. She slammed a real estate listing on the table, screaming that I had secretly bought a $4 million New York City penthouse and demanded I hand over the keys to her. She thought she had me cornered, she yelled. My father dropped his fork in shock, and my aunt said something that froze my sister in her tracks. What none of them realized was that I had not just bought a penthouse. I had bought the entire commercial building where her husband worked, and I brought my corporate attorney to dinner as my +1. Before I continue this story, Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to legally destroy the people who share your DNA just to protect your peace. Trust me, you will want to stay for the moment. My African Amin brother-in-law realizes he is about to be investigated by the federal government. The crystal glasses at Leonardan clinket softly around us. The ambient noise of Manhattan's elite, humming, in the background of our private dining room. We were supposed to be celebrating Grandma Beatrix's 80th birthday, and my 28-year-old sister Madison decided it was the perfect moment to stage an ambush. Madison reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a thick stack of printed papers, and slammed it right onto the center of the white linen tablecloth. The impact knocked over a salt shaker and caused the waiter pouring water to freeze in his tracks. The papers featured a brightly colored Zillow listing, a $4.5 million penthouse in Tribeca. Madison shrieked, her voice slicing through the elegant jazz music playing overhead. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, her eyes wide with a mix of fury and greed. You bought a $4.5 million penthouse in Tribeca and hid it from your own family. Are you planning to be selfish for the rest of your miserable life? My father, Richard, dropped his heavy silver fork onto his porcelain plate with a loud clatter. My mother, Catherine, gasped loudly, pressing her hand against her pearl necklace, as if the very concept of my financial success was a physical assault on her cardiovascular system. I did not flinch. I slowly picked up my wine glass, taking a measured sip of Cabernet before setting it down on the table. I did not hide it, Madison, I said, my voice deliberately calm and flat. It is a private real estate transaction. My assets are none of your business, and please lower your voice. You are embarrassing yourself in a Michelin star restaurant. Embarrassing myself? Madison scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. She wore a dress she definitely could not afford on her income as a lifestyle influencer, a career consisting mostly of posting photos of avocado toast and pretending to be rich. You are the embarrassment. Naomi, Jamal, and I are trying to start a family. We are living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment that barely has enough closet space for my brand collaborations. And you, a single woman with zero prospects of ever finding a husband, are hoarding a 5,000 feet penthouse all to yourself. Catherine leaned forward, her face flushed with indignation. Your sister is absolutely right, Naomi. This is exactly why people call you cold and calculating. Madison and Jamal are trying to build a future. As the older sister, you should be stepping up to help them. You do not need all that space. You should transfer the title to Madison immediately. It is the absolute least you can do for this family after everything we have been through. I stared at my mother, letting the sheer audacity of her demand hang in the air for a long moment. Transfer the title. I repeated, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. Just hand over a luxury property I paid for with my own money to a sister who has never worked a 40-hour week in her life. We are family, Richard barked from the head of the table. His face was turning a dangerous shade of red. In this family, we support each other. Your sister needs a home suitable for raising children. You have more money than you need. Clearly. Stop acting like a greedy outsider and do what is right. Support each other, I echoed, resting my forearms on the table. I locked eyes with my father, refusing to back down. That is a fascinating choice of words, Dad. Does supporting each other look like the time you took $80,000 out of my college fund to buy Madison a brand new convertible for her 23rd birthday? Because as I recall, your exact words to me were that I was smart and could figure out student loans, while your golden child needed a reliable vehicle for her personal brand. Madison rolled her eyes dramatically, sighing as loudly as she could. Oh my God. Are we really bringing up the car again? That was 5 years ago. Get over it. I spent 5 years working 3 different jobs. I fired back, my tone icy. I waited tables and managed properties just to pay off the predatory interest rates on those loans while you were driving to the Hamptons. So, no, Madison, I will absolutely not be giving you my penthouse. Go get a real job and buy one for yourself now, because I am done. The silence in the private dining room was suffocating. The wait staff sensed the hostility, purposefully steering clear of our heavy oak doors. Madison sat back, Her face contorted in pure rage. She looked frantically at our parents, expecting them to leap to her defense and force me into submission. They did not disappoint her. Catherine slammed her hand onto the table, her diamond rings clinking loudly against her wine glass. You are delusional, Naomi. You have always been prone to making up these wild, vindictive stories just to play the victim. We never took money from your college fund. That money was reallocated because your sister actually had a clear vision for her future, while you were wasting time on useless entry-level jobs. We were trying to teach you financial responsibility. And look at you now. You are successful. You should be thanking us instead of throwing these petty accusations in our faces. Thanking you? I asked, leaning forward, refusing to break eye contact with my mother. You want me to thank you for kicking me out the day I turned 18, with nothing but a garbage bag full of clothes. You want me to thank you for ignoring my calls when I was sleeping on a friend's couch because I could not afford rent and tuition at the same time. You claim you taught me financial responsibility. No, Mother. You taught me that my survival meant nothing if it inconvenienced your perfect image. You taught me that Madison's luxury lifestyle was a necessity, while my basic needs were a burden to be discarded. My father, Richard, leaned over his plate, his face purple with anger. He pointed his steak knife directly at me. Do not speak to your mother that way. You have carried this ridiculous grudge for 15 years, Naomi. It is completely pathetic. We made a strategic family investment in Madison. Her influencer brand required startup capital. You were entirely capable of working your way through school. Now you are hoarding millions of dollars in luxury real estate while your sister tries to build a family in a tiny apartment. You are a cold, ungrateful woman. We invite you to dinner and you deliberately humiliate your sister. I am not humiliating anyone, I stated flatly. I am simply refusing to be extorted by people who call themselves family. You invited me here tonight specifically because Madison found that Zillow listing. You did not invite me to celebrate Grandma B. Tatrick. You invited me to orchestrate a highly coordinated shakedown. You want me to hand over a $4.5 million asset because Madison wants a better backdrop for her fake internet photos. It is not going to happen today, and it is not going to happen tomorrow. Madison shrieked, slamming both her hands on the table, hard enough to rattle the silverware. It is not just about photos. Jamal and I are building a legacy. We are the ones who will give Mom and Dad grandchildren. We are the ones carrying this family forward into the future. You are just a bitter spinster who cares more about property deeds than your own flesh and blood. You owe us this penthouse. You owe this family for raising you, feeding you, and putting a roof over your head for 18 years. I owe you absolutely nothing, I replied, my voice dropping to a deadly calm that commanded the entire room. I paid my own way. I built my own firm from the ground up. I secured my own capital. While you were taking $200,000 from Mom and Dad to fund your lavish destination wedding, I was working 80-hour weeks closing commercial real estate deals. You want a legacy, Madison? Try actually earning one instead of begging for mine like a spoiled child. That was when Jamal decided to intervene. Jamal is 31, an African-American financial analyst at a mid-tier firm on Wall Street. He married Madison 2 years ago, clearly under the impression he was marrying into immense generational wealth. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit and nervously adjusted a thick gold watch on his wrist. I knew he had financed that watch on a 36-month payment plan because my firm ran a comprehensive background check on him months ago. Jamal was obsessed with projecting an image of untouchable power. He leaned forward, steepling his fingers together, trying to look deeply intimidating. He cleared his throat, attempting to project the calm authority of a seasoned executive dealing with an unruly subordinate. Listen to me very carefully, Naomi, Jamal said, his voice dropping an octave to sound commanding. You got lucky with a few residential real estate flips, but you are playing completely out of your league here. Real wealth is built on connections, high-level Wall Street connections. You do not want to make an enemy out of me or my firm. I looked at Jamal, taking in his aggressive posture and the sheer delusion radiating from every pore of his body. The temptation to laugh right in his face was almost overpowering. You are going to threaten me right now, Jamal? I asked, raising a single arched eyebrow. It is not a threat. It is a promise, Jamal countered, leaning closer across the table until I could smell his expensive cologne. I know exactly how your industry works. I know how heavily you rely on institutional backing for your commercial acquisitions. If you do not cooperate with the family today, I can make a few discreet phone calls. I can freeze your access to institutional capital by tomorrow morning. I will personally ensure no major bank in this entire city underwrites your next project. Do not test me. You are just a lucky real estate broker. I move millions of dollars before lunch. You hand over the penthouse to me and my wife, or your little company goes bankrupt by the third quarter. It is your choice. The sheer audacity of Jamal's ultimatum hung in the stale air of the private dining room. I looked at his perfectly manicured hands, at the heavy gold watch he kept flashing under the restaurant lights, and let a slow, deliberate smile stretch across my face. I did not shrink back into my chair. I did not break eye contact. Bankrupt by the third quarter, I repeated, letting the words roll off my tongue as if I were analyzing a fascinating insect under a microscope. That is a highly specific timeline, Jamal. Tell me, does the compliance department at your financial firm know you are using their corporate weight to extort private citizens during family dinners? Or do they just actively encourage their analysts to commit federal blackmail between the appetizers and the main course? Jamal let out a sharp, condescending laugh, leaning back in his chair and unbuttoning his suit jacket to project total physical dominance. Compliance reports to people like me. Naomi, you clearly do not understand how this city works. I sit in boardrooms with managing directors who can buy and sell your entire property portfolio before they even finish their morning coffee. You are a small fish swimming in an ocean you do not understand. I am offering you a lifeline today. Give us the penthouse, and I will make sure your little company stays afloat. Fight me, and I will make sure you never close another commercial real estate deal in Manhattan. Madison beamed at her husband, her eyes wide with total unquestioning adoration. She reached over and squeezed his arm, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband had just confessed to attempted extortion in a public venue. You really should listen to him, Naomi Madison said, her voice dripping with fake sugary pity. Jamal handles accounts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He is an absolute shark on Wall Street. Hai is actually trying to do you a massive favor by keeping this asset transfer within the family. If you make him mad, he will crush your little real estate hobby and not even lose a single second of sleep over it. Just hand over the keys. I already have a vision board for the renovations anyway. I am thinking of knocking down the guest bedroom walls to build a walk-in closet for my brand sponsorships. A hobby, I repeated, turning my gaze from Madison to my mother. Catherine was nodding vigorously in agreement with her golden child. This is exactly what happens when you stubbornly refuse to find a capable husband to manage your affairs, Catherine lectured, pointing her crystal wine glass directly at my chest. You get completely out of your depth. You have no idea how high-level finance operates. Jamal is a certified expert in wealth management. You should be down on your knees thanking him for taking this massive property burden off your shoulders. We are giving you an easy way out, Naomi. I took another slow sip of my wine, watching them perform their synchronized illusion. My father, Richard, crossed his arms tightly across his chest, projecting the image of a deeply disappointed patriarch. The family has reached a consensus, Naomi Richard declared, speaking as if his absurd words held actual legal binding power. The penthouse belongs to Madison and Jamal now. We will have the deed transfer papers drafted first thing on Monday morning. You will sign them, and in exchange Jamal will graciously ensure your company is protected from market volatility. It is a win for everyone involved. Now, apologize to your brother-in-law for disrespecting his authority. I set my glass down, the sharp clink cutting through their fantasy. You are all suffering from a severe, highly contagious delusion, I stated flatly. You think raising your voices and throwing around corporate buzzwords makes you powerful. Jamal, you claim you can freeze my access to institutional capital by tomorrow morning. That is fascinating, because to do that, you would need to be a senior partner or a managing director with unilateral authority over commercial lending. But you are not a managing director, are you? You are a mid-tier analyst who spends his days updating spreadsheets for the people who actually hold the power. Jamal slammed his open palm onto the table, the sudden violence causing Madison to jump in her seat. His calm, arrogant facade slipped completely, revealing the desperate, aggressive man hiding underneath the expensive tailored suit. "Do not ever disrespect my rank," Jamal snarled, his voice rising in volume as he abandoned his professional tone. "You have zero idea who you are messing with. I know exactly how your firm operates, Naomi. I know you rely heavily on bridge loans and mezzanine financing to acquire those properties. I have friends at every major bank in this financial district. One phone call from me and your credit lines dry up completely. I will call in every favor I have. I will burn your business reputation to the absolute ground. You will be blacklisted from every real estate auction in the state until you are completely ruined." I watched the sweat bead on his forehead, noting the erratic pulse visible in his neck. He was pushing too hard, threatening too loudly. He was exposing his hand. "You think you hold power because you wear a suit that costs more than your monthly rent?" "Jamal," I asked, "I have dealt with actual managing partners. They do not raise their voices at dinner parties. They do not threaten women over appetizers. They execute quietly. You are loud because you are terrified." Jamal glared at me, his chest heaving. "You arrogant witch. I have insider knowledge on market shifts that your little brain cannot even comprehend. My firm manages the portfolios of politicians and tech billionaires. We control the commercial sector. I can bury your company in compliance audits. I can flag your real estate group to the IRS. I can make your life an absolute living hell until you are begging me to take this penthouse off your hands. You seem incredibly obsessed with my liquidity, Jamal," I noted calmly, tilting my head to study his frantic behavior. "For a man who supposedly moves millions before lunch, you seem awfully desperate to get your hands on my property right this very second. You are sweating. You are shouting. You are threatening to destroy my business over a family dinner. Are you absolutely sure you are not the one who desperately needs a financial bailout?" Jamal froze. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking sickly under the warm restaurant lights. He looked frantically toward Richard, his aggressive posture deflating for a fraction of a second before he puffed his chest back out in a desperate show of bravado. "Richard, handle your daughter," Jamal demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "I am trying to offer her a clean, mutually beneficial exit, but my patience is completely gone. Put her in line before I take matters into my own hands and destroy her firm." Richard stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back so hard it scraped loudly against the floor. He reached down into his leather briefcase, his face twisted in absolute fury, ready to escalate this shakedown to the next level. Richard slammed a thick stack of legal documents onto the white tablecloth, right next to my wine glass. The top page bore the crest of a major commercial bank. I did not flinch, simply shifting my gaze from the papers to his red face. "This is a $2 million commercial loan guarantee," Richard announced, his voice echoing loudly in the private dining room. "Jamal is launching his own independent financial advisory firm. He needs immediate startup capital. The bank requires a hard asset for collateral. Since you have selfishly hoarded a $4.5 million property, you are going to sign this document tonight as the primary guarantor." I looked down at the documents. I did not even need to read the fine print to know how absurd this proposition was. "You want me to put up my primary residence to back a high-rises commercial loan for a man who has zero experience running his own firm?" "I have 10 years of Wall Street experience," Jamal snapped aggressively, adjusting his silk tie. "My new firm is a guaranteed success. I already have verbal commitments from high net worth individuals. The bank just needs a signature to release the funds. You are not actually risking anything, Naomi. It is a pure formality, a technicality to satisfy the underwriters." "A formality," I repeated, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. "If it is a pure formality, Jamal, why are you not using your own assets? Why doesn't Madison put up her assets?" "Oh wait, Madison's net worth is entirely comprised of maxed-out credit cards and gifted designer bags." "Shut up," Madison shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical frequency. You are just trying to ruin my life because you are a jealous, bitter woman. Mom, tell her to sign it. Make her sign the paper right now. Catherine reached across the table, her eyes welling with highly practiced, entirely fake tears. She placed a trembling hand over her heart. Naomi, please stop this vicious behavior immediately. Your father and I have worked our entire lives to build a legacy for this family. We cannot liquidate our retirement accounts right now because they are tied up in complex investment vehicles. You have the liquidity. You have the physical asset. If you love us, if you have any basic respect for the family that gave you life, you will pick up a pen and sign that contract. Do not destroy your sister's future over a petty grudge. You gave me life, Catherine, and then you gave me an eviction notice on my 18th birthday. I fired back, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I paid my own rent. I paid my own tuition. I built my own firm. My assets belong to my holding company, not to you, and certainly not to Jamal. Your emotional manipulation is completely useless. Richard slammed his fist on the table again, causing Grandma Beatrix's water glass to shake. You ungrateful brat, I am your father. I am the patriarch of this family. I am ordering you to sign the guarantee. If you refuse to support your sister and your brother-in-law today, you are completely cut off. You will be disowned. I will erase your name from the family trust. I will make sure every relative we have knows you abandoned your pregnant sisters when she needed you most. You will never be welcome in our home at our holidays or in our lives ever again. You sign this paper right now, or you are dead to us. The sheer lack of self-awareness was staggering. I looked at the man who had happily spent my college savings on a luxury car for his favorite daughter, now threatening to disown the daughter who had already survived without him for 15 years. Disown me? I asked, my voice deadly calm. Dad, you cannot disown someone who already walked away. You cut me off financially a decade and a half ago. I survived. I thrived. I built a multi-million-dollar real estate investment firm while you coddled Madison into a state of absolute financial dependency. Your threat means absolutely nothing to me. Jamal leaned forward, his arrogance returning in a desperate, ugly wave. You think this is a game, Naomi? You think you can just walk away from this table? The bank needs that collateral by Monday morning. If I do not get this funding, my entire business plan collapses. If my business plan collapses, I am going to make it my personal mission to ensure your firm faces intense regulatory scrutiny. I know people at the SEC. I know aggressive auditors. I will drown your LLC in so much red tape you will be begging to sign this house over to me just to make it stop. I finally reached out and pulled the contract toward me. I flipped to the second page, scanning the financial terms. The interest rate was incredibly predatory. A clear sign that whatever bank drafted this considered Jamal a massive liability. But something else caught my eye immediately. The lending institution was a secondary subsidiary, not a Tier 1 bank. This was a lender of absolute last resort. Jamal, I said, tapping the heavy paper with my manicured finger. This is a high-yield mezzanine loan from a secondary lender. Tier 1 banks rejected your application entirely, did they not? You did not go to Chase or Goldman Sachs because your credit profile is a complete disaster. You are trying to secure $2 million at an 18% interest rate, and you want to strap that ticking financial time bomb directly to my penthouse. Jamal's jaw clenched tight. Heavy sweat was visibly forming on his brow. It is a short-term bridge loan. It is strictly temporary until the client funds clear the escrow accounts. It is financial suicide, I corrected him sharply, holding his completely terrified gaze. And I am not going down with your sinking ship. Madison slammed her hands against the edge of the table, pushing herself up from her chair. Her face contorted into a mask of pure indignation. How dare you speak to my husband like that? Madison shrieked, her voice echoing off the private dining room walls. Jamal is building an empire. You are trying to tear him down because you are miserable. You sit alone in your giant apartment every night with absolutely nobody to share it with. You are insanely jealous of my life, Naomi. You are jealous that I have a loving husband, a beautiful home, and a thriving career that people actually care about. I slowly turned my head, shifting my focus away from Jamal's sweating face, to look directly at my sister. The sheer delusion radiating from her was almost fascinating to witness. A thriving career, I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously level. You consider posting photographs of avocado toast and free skincare samples to be a thriving career. I am a lifestyle influencer, Madison snapped, flipping her perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder. I have brand partnerships. I have an audience. I cultivate an aesthetic that inspires hundreds of thousands of people every single day. My platform generates actual cultural value, unlike your boring real estate contracts. I am building a brand that will sustain my family for decades. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. It is funny you bring up your brand, Madison. Because when Jamal demanded that I hand over my penthouse, I naturally felt obligated to do some basic due diligence on the two people attempting to extort me. When someone asks me to assume $2 million of risk, I verify their liquidity. So, I had my corporate team run a comprehensive background check on both of you. Madison crossed her arms tightly over her chest, jutting her chin out in a display of false bravado. Go ahead. Tell everyone how successful my engagement metrics are. I have absolutely nothing to hide. Catherine nodded vigorously from across the table, eager to defend her golden child. Madison makes 6 figures easily. Naomi, she receives PR packages from top-tier designers every week. She just booked a luxury trip to the Amalfi Coast next month. Her success is highly visible to anyone who actually pays attention to modern business. You simply do not understand the digital economy. I looked at my mother with a mixture of pity and absolute disdain. The digital economy, I said, leaning back in my chair. Let us talk about Madison's digital economy. Mother, do you genuinely believe your favorite daughter earns 6 figures? Because according to the verified financial profiles my team pulled, Madison's lifestyle brand generated exactly $14,650 in gross revenue last year. The entire table froze. Richard frowned, looking from me to Madison. That is impossible, Richard argued, his voice losing some of its aggressive edge. She just bought a Chanel bag that costs more than $10,000. We see her lifestyle. She is clearly generating massive income. She is not generating income, Dad, I corrected him sharply. She is generating debt, massive, catastrophic, unrecoverable debt. Madison's face drained of all color. She dropped her arms to her sides, her false confidence completely shattering. Shut your mouth, Naomi. Madison hissed, her voice suddenly shaking. You are making things up to make me look bad in front of Grandma Beatrice. I did not even look at Grandma Beatrice, keeping my eyes locked on my sister. I am not making anything up, Madison. Your entire life is a carefully curated lie. You bought your Instagram followers using an offshore click farm. Your engagement metrics are completely artificial. And to maintain this pathetic illusion of wealth, you have been funding your lifestyle on borrowed plastic. That is a complete lie, Madison cried out, looking desperately at our parents. She is lying, Mom. She is trying to destroy my marriage. Jamal, tell them she is lying. But Jamal did not defend her. He sat frozen in his chair, staring at Madison with a look of absolute horror. He clearly believed he had married a woman with an endless trust fund. He had no idea his wife was digging a financial grave right next to his own. I am not lying, and you all know it, I stated, cutting through Madison's fake sobs. Every luxury trip, every designer outfit, every extravagant dinner you post online is funded by credit cards. You can never pay back. You want specifics? You currently owe $45,000 to American Express. You owe $60,000 to Chase Sapphire. You owe another $45,000 on a Discover card. You are sitting in a Michelin star restaurant, wearing a designer dress, while drowning in exactly $150,000 of high-interest credit card debt. You are completely insolvent, Madison, Catherine gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She stared at Madison, her eyes wide with shock. Madison, tell me she is lying. Tell me you do not have $150,000 in debt. Madison burst into loud, theatrical tears, burying her face in her hands. You came here tonight, expecting to guilt me into handing over my penthouse so you could liquidate it and save yourselves. I said you called me selfish. You said I was ungrateful. But I am the only person at this table who actually knows the value of $1. I turned my gaze back to Jamal, whose face was slick with terrified sweat. Now, Jamal, I said softly, let us get back to your brilliant plan to destroy my real estate firm. Because I think it is time we discuss exactly why you are so desperate for a $2 million commercial loan. Jamal shifted his weight, his custom suit suddenly looking like a straitjacket. He grabbed his crystal water glass, his hands trembling so violently that water sloshed over the rim and onto the crisp white tablecloth. He swallowed hard, trying to summon back the arrogant Wall Street persona he had worn just 10 minutes ago. "You do not know what you are talking about," Jamal said, though his voice lacked any real conviction. "My business plan is completely solid. I am securing capital for an elite wealth management firm. It is a standard operational procedure. You are trying to deflect from Madison's spending habits to save your own face." I smiled, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the table. "An elite wealth management firm. That is a brilliant cover story, Jamal. It truly is. It sounds prestigious. It sounds like the logical next step for a rising star at Apex Financial. But we both know there is absolutely no new firm. There are no high net W worth clients lining up to hand you their portfolios. You are not trying to build an empire. You are trying to buy your way out of a federal indictment." Richard frowned, looking frantically between me and his son-in-law. "Federal indictment. Naomi, what kind of ridiculous accusation is this?" "Jamal is a senior analyst. He has a spotless record at his company." I had a spotless record. "Dad," I corrected him, keeping my eyes locked on Jamal until approximately 3 weeks ago. "Tell them, Jamal. Tell your loving, supportive in-laws exactly why you have been sitting in downtown coffee shops from 9 to 5:00 every single day instead of going into the office. Tell them why your corporate email account was abruptly deactivated last Tuesday morning." Jamal's face flushed a deep, panicked ash in color. "I am on administrative leave," he stammered, his eyes darting toward the restaurant doors, as if calculating the distance for a quick escape. "It is a routine internal audit. Everyone goes through it. It is a completely standard compliance protocol. Standard compliance protocol does not involve the Securities and Exchange Commission." I fired back, my voice razor sharp. "Standard compliance protocol does not result in your access badges being revoked and security escorting you out of the building in front of your entire trading floor." Madison stopped crying long enough to look at her husband, her tear-streaked face twisted in utter confusion. "Jamal, what is she saying? You told me you were working from home to finalize the pitch deck for the new company." "He lied to you, Madison," I said, almost feeling a brief flash of pity before remembering her earlier viciousness. "Your husband is not starting a business. He is desperately trying to secure a $2 million commercial loan to quietly reimburse Apex Financial before they turn his file over to the federal authorities for criminal prosecution." Catherine let out a sharp gasp, clutching Richard's arm tightly. "This is a complete fabrication," Richard bellowed, standing up from his chair. "Jamal is a financial genius. He handles massive accounts. He definitely handled them." I agreed smoothly, right into the ground. "Let me explain exactly what your financial genius of a son-in-law has been doing. Jamal, please correct me if any of my details are inaccurate. About 4 months ago, you realized Madison's credit card debt was spiraling completely out of control. You needed cash fast to maintain the wealthy image you both so desperately craved. So, you decided to play God with your client's money. You engaged in highly leveraged, unauthorized margin trading." Jamal squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head. "Stop. Just stop talking right now. No, I think the family deserves to know the brilliant strategy behind your financial demands." I continued relentlessly. "For those who do not understand Wall Street terminology, margin trading essentially means borrowing money from a broker to purchase stock. It is incredibly risky." But Jamal did not use his own money. He used client funds to guarantee highly speculative options trades, hoping to pocket the massive yields and quietly put the original funds back before anyone noticed his actions. The private dining room was so silent you could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. My parents stared at Jamal, waiting for him to erupt, to scream that it was a lie to threaten me with a massive defamation lawsuit. But Jamal just stared at his lap, looking exactly like a man marching toward the gallows. "The problem with highly leveraged options," I said, enjoying the absolute terror radiating from his side of the table, "is that when the market turns against you, the losses are catastrophic. The trades went bad. You received a margin call you could not cover. And by the time the compliance officers at Apex Financial flagged the unauthorized transactions, you had vaporized $850,000 of client capital. Oh my God, Madison whispered, her hands covering her mouth. Jamal, tell me, this is a nightmare. Tell me she is lying to us. Jamal finally looked up, his eyes wild and deeply defensive. I was going to fix it, he shouted, slamming his fist on the heavy wooden table. The market acted irrationally. It was a temporary dip. If compliance had just given me another 48 hours, the positions would have rebounded completely. I could have made the money back. But they did not give you 48 hours, did they? I asked coldly. They suspended you. They launched a full forensic audit, and they gave you a strict ultimatum. You either replace the missing $850, VUSNN, and pay the massive corporate fines, or they hand you over to the feds for embezzlement and wire fraud. That is why you need $2 million right now. You need to pay back the firm, cover the penalties, and have enough left over to maintain the illusion that you voluntarily quit to start your own business. The absolute silence that followed my statement was shattered by a piercing, guttural scream from Madison. She shoved her chair back so violently it toppled over, crashing against the heavy mahogany paneling of the private dining room. The fine china rattled, and a waiter who had been hovering near the service door practically sprinted in the opposite direction. You are a liar, Madison shrieked, her voice cracking under the sheer force of her hysteria. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw breath. You made all of this up. You hired investigators to fabricate fake financial reports just to humiliate us in front of Grandma Beatrice. You cannot stand the fact that Jamal is successful, that he loves me, that we have a perfect life, while you sleep alone in some empty penthouse. Jamal reached out, grabbing Madison's wrist in a desperate attempt to pull her back down. Madison, please lower your voice. Sit down. We can figure this out. I can explain the margin calls. But Madison violently yanked her arm away from her husband, her eyes blazing with absolute denial. Do not let her intimidate you, Jamal. She is a miserable, jealous spinster. She has always been jealous of me because Mom and Dad actually loved me, and they threw her out the second she turned 18. She wants to see me fail so she can feel better about her own pathetic, lonely existence. I simply watched her meltdown, feeling absolutely nothing. The contrast between her designer gown and her completely unhinged behavior was striking. I do not need to fabricate federal violations, Madison, I replied, my voice slicing through her tantrum with cold precision. The Securities and Exchange Commission does not take requests from jealous sisters. Your husband committed a massive financial crime. Your credit cards are completely maxed out. Your perfect life is an illusion built on stolen client funds and high-interest debt. Stop talking to her like that, Catherine shrieked, slamming her napkin onto the table and rushing to Madison's side. She wrapped her arms tightly around her golden child, glaring at me with a level of hatred that was almost breathtaking. You are a monster, Naomi, a cold, calculating monster. You invited your own family to a birthday dinner just to launch this vicious, unprovoked attack on your sister's marriage. I did not invite you to dinner to attack anyone, Mother. I corrected her firmly. You invited me to this dinner. You staged this entire gathering specifically to force me into signing over a $4.5 million asset. You brought commercial loan documents to a restaurant. You attempted an organized financial shakedown. I simply arrived prepared because you are a stain on this family's name. Catherine screamed. Her face flushed dark red completely, abandoning any pretense of upper-class dignity. We raised you with everything you ever needed, and you grew up into a vindictive, ruthless snake. Madison is a beautiful, loving wife who is trying to build a future. Jamal made a simple calculation error at work. A tiny mistake that any high financial executive could make during a stressful quarter. You have the money to fix this instantly, but instead you choose to sit there and gloat over their temporary misfortune. A calculation error. I raised an eyebrow, looking at my mother in genuine disbelief. He illegally gambled $850,000 of other people's money and lost it all. That is not a calculation error. That is grand larceny. And your solution to this felony is for me to mortgage my primary residence at an 18% interest rate. Richard stepped forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He positioned himself between me and his favorite daughter, acting as the protective patriarch, defending his family against an outside threat. You listen to me, Naomi. I do not care what Jamal did or did not do at his firm. Corporate politics are cutthroat, and sometimes aggressive risks are required to achieve greatness. If his firm lacks the stomach for true Wall Street strategy, that is their problem. But you are going to solve this family crisis right now. I am not solving anything, Dad, I stated evenly. You will sign the loan guarantee. Richard roared, his voice booming across the dining table. You will put up that penthouse and you will secure Jamal's exit strategy. We are your parents, we command respect. You owe your entire existence to us. And if you think you can just walk away and let your sister's husband face a federal indictment, you are severely underestimating my authority in this family. Your authority? I repeated, letting out a sharp laugh. You have zero authority over me, Richard. You lost your parental authority the night you packed my belongings into trash bags and changed the locks on the front door because I refused to co-sign a loan for your failing business ventures 15 years ago. You threw me to the wolves and now you are absolutely furious that I returned leading the pack. Madison burst into loud theatrical tears, burying her face against Catherine's shoulder. Mom, make her stop. She is ruining everything. My entire brand will be destroyed if Jamal goes to prison. My followers will find out. The sponsorships will cancel my contracts. You have to make her sign the papers. Do not worry, sweetheart. Catherine cooped, stroking Madison's hair while shooting venomous glares in my direction. Your sister is just throwing a tantrum to negotiate better terms. She is deeply insecure and desperate for our attention. She will sign the papers because she knows deep down that she needs this family to validate her pathetic little real estate company. My pathetic little real estate company. I echoed my smile slowly, fading into a look of absolute unforgiving steel. That is an incredibly interesting assessment, Mother, because that pathetic little company has grown significantly in the past few weeks. Jamal swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the document still resting near my plate. His breathing was shallow, rapid, indicating an impending panic attack. What did you do? Naomi, Jamal asked, his voice trembling uncontrollably. What else did your investigators find? I did not look at Jamal. I looked directly at my father, who was still standing tall, still completely convinced he could bully me into submission through sheer volume and parental demands. They thought this was the peak of the conflict. They thought my refusal to sign the loan guarantee was the ultimate weapon I had brought to the table. They had absolutely no idea that the real destruction had not even started yet. I simply turned my head toward the quiet man sitting beside me. David Thorne had been nursing his espresso for the past 45 minutes. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that exuded quiet authority. His posture relaxed but relentlessly observant. He had watched my family scream, threaten, and melt down with the detached fascination of a scientist observing a highly predictable experiment. Dad, Mom, Madison, and Jamal, I said, my voice cutting through the heavy tension in the private dining room. You assumed I brought a date to this little ambush. I did not. Allow me to formally introduce David Thorne. He is the lead corporate counsel for my real estate investment firm. And unlike Jamal, David actually holds the power to freeze assets and end careers. Richard stared at David, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Catherine clutched her napkin, her eyes darting between me and the lawyer in sheer panic. David set his espresso cup down on the pristine white saucer. The soft clink echoed like a gavel striking a sound block. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, leaned forward, and folded his hands neatly on the table. Good evening, David said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely devoid of the emotional hysteria my family was so accustomed to weaponizing. It is truly fascinating to finally meet the people Naomi has described to me. I must admit, witnessing this attempted financial extortion firsthand is far more educational than reading about it in a legal brief. Extortion, Richard bellowed, his face, flushing a deep crimson again. He pointed a trembling finger at David. Who the hell do you think you are? This is a private family dinner. You have absolutely no right to be here, and you have no right to interfere in family business. Get out before I call the restaurant manager and have you removed by security." David did not blink. He did not raise his voice. He simply reached into his own sleek leather briefcase, resting by his chair, and pulled out a stack of documents bearing the official seal of my holding company. "I am here under direct capacity as Naomi's legal representation," David replied, sliding the documents onto the table. "And I strongly advise you to lower your voice, Richard. Because what you call family business, the United States federal government calls a conspiracy to commit wire fraud and bank fraud." Jamal visibly recoiled, pressing himself so hard against the back of his chair that the wood creaked in protest. Madison looked frantically from Jamal to David, her manicured hands trembling violently in her lap. "Fraud," Catherine shrieked, her pearls practically vibrating against her chest. "How dare you? My husband is a respected businessman. We are simply asking our selfish daughter to provide a temporary commercial bridge loan for her brother-in-law. It is a standard practice among wealthy families. There is absolutely nothing standard about this." David countered his tone perfectly. Even he picked up the commercial